The night in UMuse was filled with confusion and fear. People were running, voices were raised, and the sound of sirens echoed through the streets. Chief Darlington, a man everyone respected, had been rushed to the hospital after a strange accident. Nobody knew exactly what happened, but the way people whispered made it clear. Something was not right. Inside the hospital, the air was thick with tension. Nurses moved quickly, doctors shouted instructions, and family members crowded the waiting area with worried faces. Among them sat his only daughter, Ifunanya. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her wrapper loosely tied around her waist, her scarf slipping as she shook from head to toe. She kept whispering prayers, clutching her hands tightly as if God could hear her better if she held on harder. People tried to console her, but she hardly listened. She kept asking the same questions again and again. Is my father alive? Will he make it? No one could give her an answer. Every second felt like an hour. Every sound from the emergency room made her heart stop. The man who had been her protector, her guide, her everything was now lying between life and death, and she could do nothing but wait. Sissy freely with an Irish polish. Nurse, Emma Sernet spare with the any fit. Yeah, with what I made no mas. Nine even which sit net a scat lock was sit when you master. He is no. That's never still I rather know your vanil. Self mark wish than a sea brush so name Ognar. Sir, Neneth besagen it is such near romas. Failure the for healer snow we red and at the alley reaching here for her. Frogs surface that eat those reaching you bell. Herno when they lay out as ich that's it. I must sweet for silver. I the dance of sin midlasted. But sit met them here existed no wish. Now I made it now what I'm with sir my meal my fan was in a v. Seaman at the flowers are the for wasn't him. Saft call wish no snitch sir mark was the burhish. He desire ich the scamide. Her nazia are life between any fit. We're grief for the with herbs it will be Roman. Here was singing air for me as if when a jerv nerfit did your law hot verno here. Sask if a sillage nibbo silver rap past the nail but up. Oh, that net is can't answer with its sisters or the Nazio nibbe here heather opsmas. Sermer rauch with dinner serves it with offing all getting it. While keeps it there foolish with their kiss there no we rat was a Eva love for it. Hurry his any fit out and it gets their werp so. Her than an hour silk meals are the up. Here, but you net perhaps the hurt the asmas. Stay so as a sensitive net serbian. Swift alarms nifnil art fish the dark so walking it a word of saha. The hours dragged on like endless nights. Every tick of the hospital clock sounded louder than the last. Ifunanya sat with her hands clenched together so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She kept staring at the door of the emergency ward, praying, begging silently that it would open and someone would tell her that her father was safe. But when the door finally opened, it was not hope that came out, it was despair. The doctor stepped into the hall, his face pale and heavy, his eyes filled with the kind of sorrow that needed no words. Everyone stood to their feet at once, their hearts pounding. He looked at them slowly, then shook his head. His voice was low, yet it cut through the silence like a knife. Prepare yourselves, his chances are gone. For a moment the hall froze. Ifunanya blinked, as if she didn't hear correctly. Then the meaning hit her all at once. A scream tore from her chest, raw and heartbreaking, filling the hall with grief. She dropped to her knees, clutching her wrapper as her body shook uncontrollably. No, no, not my father, she cried, her voice echoing down the corridor. Some family members rushed toward her, their hands on her shoulders, muttering words of comfort. But behind their soft words, their eyes told another story. Some looked almost relieved, others seemed already distracted, as though their minds were racing toward what would happen next. His properties, his businesses, his wealth. Their fake sympathy only deepened the wound in her heart. Ifunanya buried her face in her palms, her tears soaking through her fingers. She could still see her father's smile in her mind, hear his laughter, remember the way he called her my jewel. And now just like that they were telling her he was gone. The weight of it crushed her chest until it was hard to breathe. The hall was filled with muffled sobs and whispers, But to her the world had gone silent. All she could feel was an emptiness that stretched wider than the sky. Felt like H. The hospital room was quiet, almost too quiet, except for the faint beeping of the machines that were slowly counting down her father's last breaths. The fluorescent light above flickered weakly, casting shadows on the pale walls. Ifunanya pushed the door open with trembling hands, her wrapper loosely tied and her scarf slipping as though it too shared her sorrow. Her steps were slow, heavy, as if every move pulled her deeper into a nightmare she could not wake from. Chief Darlington lay motionless on the hospital bed, his once strong body now weak and lifeless. Tubes ran across his chest, his skin pale, his lips cracked. His eyes were closed, but to Ifunanya, he still looked like the father who had always carried her on his shoulders when she was little, the man who never allowed a single tear to fall from her eyes without wiping it away. Seeing him like this broke something inside her. She walked closer, her knees almost giving way, and gently reached for his hand. It was cold, too cold, and the touch made her cry even harder. "Papa," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please don't leave me. Who will I run to now? Who will protect me the way you always did?" Her tears dripped onto his hand as if they could bring warmth back to him. She bent closer, resting her forehead against his arm, whispering goodbye with words she could barely form. The memories came rushing. His laughter during family dinners, his voice calling her my jewel, the way he would tell her stories about hard work and honesty. Every memory was now a blade cutting her deeper. She wanted to believe he could still hear her, that somewhere inside, her words were reaching him. The machines continued their faint beeping, the only reply to her cries. The room felt colder, lonelier, and crueler with every passing second. She stayed there, holding his hand tightly as if refusing to let death take him away. In that dimly lit room, Ifunanya's whispered goodbye carried all the love, all the pain, and all. Ifunanya sat by the bedside, still clutching her father's hand, her tears falling endlessly. She had accepted in her heart that he was gone, that she had just said her last goodbye. The weight of that truth pressed on her chest until she could barely breathe. But then something happened, something she could not explain. At first it was so small that she thought she imagined it. His fingers, the same cold fingers she had been holding for hours, twitched gently against her palm. She froze, staring at his hand, too scared to believe. Her breath caught in her throat. "Papa," she whispered, her voice shaking. She looked up at his face, and to her shock, his eyelids began to flutter. Slowly, painfully, they opened, revealing weak, tired eyes that seemed to search for her. Her heart skipped several beats. She almost screamed, but her voice was trapped in her throat. "Papa! Papa, it's me, Ifunanya. I'm here!" she cried, leaning close, her tears falling on his chest. His lips moved slightly, trembling as though it took all the strength in him just to form a word. She leaned in closer, desperate to catch every sound. His breathing was shallow, his body weak, but his gaze was fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart race. The room felt like it had stopped breathing with him. The beeping of the machine seemed louder, slower, each sound echoing in her ears. She pressed her hand tighter around his, her eyes wide with both hope and fear. This was impossible, yet it was happening right in front of her. Ifunanya's tears fell faster, a mix of relief and terror. She wanted to believe this was a miracle, that her father was coming back to her, but the look in his eyes told her something else. This was not life returning. This was his last fight to tell her something that mattered more than his own breath. And she knew deep inside that whatever word he was about to say would change everything. Ifunanya bent close, almost pressing her ear to her father's trembling lips. His breath was shallow, broken, each word costing him more strength than his body could give. She held his hand tightly, whispering, "Papa, I'm here. Please talk to me." His eyes, dim yet burning with urgency, locked onto hers. His lips quivered, forming a sound that came out like a faint whisper. She leaned closer, praying she wouldn't miss it. And then she heard it, a name. A single name, heavy and sharp, falling from his mouth like a stone dropped into water. For a moment Ifunanya froze. She blinked, certain she had misheard. But his lips moved again, repeating the same name, even weaker this time. Her heart stopped. That name didn't belong to a stranger. It wasn't some faceless business rival or an enemy from the outside. No, it was someone close. Someone she trusted. Someone she had never imagined would be capable of betraying him. Her whole body trembled as the truth hit her like lightning. She pulled back slightly, staring at her father in disbelief, her eyes wide with horror. "No. Papa, no, it can't be," she whispered, her voice breaking. But his faint nod, the desperate squeeze of his weak fingers around hers, confirmed it. He had used the last of his strength not to ask for help, not to beg for life, but to expose the one who destroyed him. Tears poured down Ifunanya's face as she leaned over him again, sobbing, "Papa, please don't leave me. Please stay." But even as she begged, she knew he had given her all he could, his truth. His chest rose slowly, then fell. His eyes closed, his hand grew still, and the room was filled with a silence more terrifying than death itself. Ifunanya sat frozen, her father's final words ringing in her head. The name echoed over and over, burning into her memory. It was someone she least expected, someone she loved. And now she was left with the impossible burden of carrying her father's last secret, the name of his killer. Ifunanya sat frozen, her father's final whisper echoing in her mind like a curse she could not escape. The name repeated itself again and again until it became unbearable. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. She had never felt fear and pain so deep. Tears poured down her face, soaking her scarf, but this time it wasn't only from grief, it was from shock. The person her father had named wasn't a stranger from the outside. It wasn't one of those rivals who envied his success. No, it was family. It was someone who shared their blood, someone who sat with them in the waiting hall pretending to mourn. Her body shook as she tried to process it. How could someone from within betray him like this? The same people who ate from his table, who wore the clothes he bought, who enjoyed the comfort of his wealth, one of them had been secretly plotting his end. The thought made her stomach turn. Betrayal from the outside was painful, but betrayal from within the family was poison. She clung to her father's hand, not ready to let go. "Papa, I hear you. I will not forget. I promise you," she whispered, her tears falling onto his cold skin. The machines beside him gave their slow, steady beeps, like the last countdown of his life. She kept praying for a miracle, for him to open his eyes again, for him to say one more word. But instead, the sound she feared the most filled the room, a long final beep that pierced her soul. Her father's chest stopped rising. His hand grew heavy in hers. Ifunanya screamed, her voice raw and desperate, shaking his arm as if she could force life back into him. But nothing changed. The man who had been her protector, her guide, her strength was gone forever. She buried her face on his chest, sobbing uncontrollably, her heart shattered. Yet in the middle of her pain, one truth burned inside her. Her father had not died in silence. He had left her with a name, and that name was now her burden to carry. Ifunanya wiped her face with the edge of her wrapper, trying to hide her swollen eyes as she stepped out of the hospital room. The waiting hall was still full of relatives, neighbors, and family friends, their voices low, their faces painted with false sorrow. Some stood in groups whispering, others sat quietly with folded arms, but every single face turned toward her as she walked in. They were expecting news. They were expecting her tears. And she gave them that. She bowed her head, letting the tears roll down her cheeks, but deep inside, her heart was not just broken, it was burning. She looked at them one by one, her eyes scanning the crowd. She saw her uncles with their stiff expressions, her aunts dabbing their eyes with handkerchiefs, her cousins pretending to be heartbroken. Among them was the one her father had named. The murderer. The betrayer. Ifunanya's chest tightened as her gaze lingered on that face. Outwardly, they looked as innocent as the rest, wearing grief like a mask. But Ifunanya knew the truth now. And the truth was like fire in her bones. Her first instinct was to scream the name out loud, to point a finger and let everyone know what her father had whispered to her with his dying breath. But she stopped herself. She remembered the weakness in his eyes, the way he had struggled to give her that truth. He had trusted her with it. And trust required wisdom. If she shouted now without proof, they would call her a liar, an emotional daughter broken by grief. They might even twist the story to protect the killer. So she stayed silent. She pressed her lips together and sat quietly, her hands trembling in her lap. From the outside, she looked like any grieving daughter. But inside, she was sharper than ever, watching, studying, and waiting. Her father's death would not go unanswered. She would gather proof. She would unmask the hidden enemy. And when the time was right, the whole family, no, the whole of UMU's, would hear the truth that had been W. The days after Chief Darlington's death felt like a blur, but Ifunanya did not let her grief bury her. Every night, when the house was quiet and the relatives were gone, she locked herself in her father's study. The room still smelled of him. His cologne, his leather chairs, the faint scent of paper and ink. Sitting there, surrounded by his books and files, gave her strength. She pulled out every folder, every drawer, every letter she could find, determined to understand who had gained from his death. At first it felt overwhelming. Papers were scattered everywhere. Business contracts, land documents, partnership deals. But as she read, patterns began to appear. Certain contracts were lopsided, showing clear signs of betrayal. Promises were broken, money was siphoned, and deals were signed behind her father's back. Ifunanya's eyes widened as she discovered signatures of people he trusted, family members who had smiled at him during dinners, who acted loyal in public, yet secretly plotted to strip him of everything. The more she read, the more her stomach turned. She found personal letters too, hidden in the drawers. Some carried threats disguised as polite words. Others carried hints of jealousy, people bitter about her father's success, angry that he had risen higher than them. Each page she unfolded revealed another layer of the greed and envy that had always been sitting quietly behind those fake smiles she saw at family gatherings. Every discovery made her heart ache, but it also fueled her resolve. She remembered her father's trembling lips, the way he had whispered that name with his dying breath. Now, with every contract she studied, every letter she opened, she saw proof that he had not been wrong. He had known who was after him. And now she knew too. Ifunanya sat back in the chair, tears filling her eyes but determination hardening her face. They thought she was just a grieving daughter, too broken to see the truth. But she was watching, she was learning. While Ifunanya cried alone in her father's study, the rest of the family gathered in the living room, pretending to mourn. Their voices were low, their faces long, but their words carried no true grief. Behind the fake tears and forced prayers, their real thoughts were about property, land, and money. They spoke in careful tones, as though they didn't want anyone to overhear, but their greed was louder than their whispers. One uncle cleared his throat and said, "We must be practical. Chief left behind too much wealth. Someone has to take charge of the companies." An aunt quickly added, "Yes, and the houses. We should make arrangements before outsiders start interfering." They all nodded, each pretending it was about protecting the family's name, when in truth, every single one of them was already calculating what piece of the inheritance would fall into their hands. They spoke of bank accounts, shares, estates, and even the vehicles parked outside. Their voices grew more confident with each suggestion, forgetting that the man they were plotting over had not even been buried yet. Some acted like they wanted to help Ifunanya, offering to guide her since she was young. But behind their smiles, their eyes betrayed their hunger. What they did not know was that Ifunanya already carried a truth none of them could imagine. She sat quietly in the corner that evening, her scarf pulled low over her face, listening to them plan as though her father's life had been nothing more than a business transaction. They believed she was too broken to understand, too lost in grief to notice. But she heard every word. In her heart, pain mixed with anger. These were the same people her father had fed, clothed, and supported. Now, with him gone, they were showing their true colors. They were not mourning, they were waiting to feast. Ifunanya clenched her fists under her wrapper, silently swearing that their greed would not go unchallenged. They thought they were playing her, but she alr. The house was full again. This time for a family gathering meant to honor Chief Darlington. Plates of food were passed around, children played in the corner, and the older relatives sat in a circle discussing funeral arrangements. To anyone else it looked like a normal family meeting, but Ifunanya knew better. Beneath the laughter and polite conversations, everyone was watching each other, waiting to see who would control what her father left behind. Ifunanya sat quietly in her chair, her face calm but her eyes sharp. She studied every movement, every smile, every word. She was no longer the grieving daughter people assumed her to be. She was now a hunter looking for cracks and masks, and it didn't take long for her to see it. When one uncle casually mentioned her father's business accounts, her eyes caught a small detail. Across the table, a cousin shifted uneasily. His hands trembled as he tried to lift his glass, his eyes darting away quickly as though afraid to meet anyone's gaze. It lasted only a second, but Ifunanya saw it. Her heart skipped. She remembered her father's dying whisper, the name that had burned into her soul. And here it was, a nervous glance, a shaking hand. The mask was slipping. She leaned back slowly, hiding her discovery. On the outside, she appeared uninterested, playing with the edge of her scarf. But inside, her blood boiled. The betrayer was scared. He thought he could hide behind fake grief and clever words, but guilt had a way of leaking through the cracks. Every time someone spoke about money, she noticed the same thing. His fingers twitching, his face growing pale, his laughter forced. The others were too busy arguing about land and properties to notice, but Ifunanya noticed everything. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to stay silent. The time had not yet come. She needed more proof, more strength. But as she watched the trembling hands of her father's killer, one truth became clear. He was afraid. And fear was the first SI. Ifunanya knew that suspicion was not enough. Her father's whisper in the trembling hands of the betrayer gave her certainty in her heart, but she needed proof the world could not deny. That was when she remembered Barrister Okere, her father's loyal lawyer, a man who had stood by Chief Darlington for decades. She went to his office late one afternoon, her eyes red from sleepless nights. "Barrister," she whispered, her voice low but firm, "I need to know the truth. Papa trusted you. Please help me." The old lawyer sighed deeply, adjusting his glasses as he studied her face. "Your father, he suspected this long before it happened," he admitted. He opened a locked cabinet and pulled out a heavy folder, placing it gently on the desk. Ifunanya's hands shook as she opened it. Inside were contracts, business agreements, and letters that carried the very name her father had whispered to her. The signatures were clear, the betrayals undeniable. Some documents showed secret transfers of money, others revealed attempts to strip her father of his power. But that was not all. Barrister Okere leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Your father was careful. He recorded meetings. He knew someone close was plotting against him." From another drawer, he produced a small device. When he pressed play, Ifunanya's heart nearly stopped. She heard voices, familiar voices, speaking in hushed but cruel tones. They spoke of greed, of removing her father so they could finally take what belonged to them. Every word was poison, every sentence a knife. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she listened. It was no longer just her father's whisper. It was solid proof. She pressed her hands against her chest, her body trembling with both grief and fury. The man everyone thought was grieving, the man pretending to be innocent, had left behind a trail too obvious to hide. Ifunanya looked at the lawyer with determination burning in her eyes. "They thought they buried the truth with Papa," she said softly. The community hall in UMUS was packed, the air thick with tension. Elders sat in the front row, their walking sticks resting beside them, while relatives filled the benches, whispering and casting suspicious glances at one another. Everyone had gathered under the pretense of honoring Chief Darlington's memory, but Ifunanya knew this day would be different. This was not just about mourning, it was about truth. When she entered, dressed in a regal Ankara gown that glowed with bold colors, the entire hall went silent. The patterns of her fabric carried strength, her scarf tied neatly, her back straight. Though her eyes were swollen from sleepless nights, her steps carried the weight of someone who had made up her mind. She walked slowly to the center of the hall, her hands clutching the folder that held her father's secrets. She looked around, her gaze sweeping across every face, the same faces that had eaten from her father's table, the same ones who had pretended to comfort her. Then she lifted her chin and spoke, her voice strong enough to silence the whispers. "My father did not die by accident," she began. Murmurs filled the room instantly, but she raised her hand and continued. "Before his last breath, he named his killer. And today I will prove it." The hall exploded with gasps, some covering their mouths, others shifting nervously in their seats. She opened the folder, pulling out the signed contracts, the crooked business deals, the letters filled with betrayal. Then she played the recordings. Familiar voices filled the hall, plotting greedily, speaking of her father's downfall. Every word cut through the air like a blade. Eyes turned sharply toward the guilty one. Faces that once wore masks of sorrow now twisted in shock. The elders slammed their walking sticks on the ground, demanding silence as Ifunanya pointed with trembling but steady hands. "This is the person who murdered my father," she declared, her voice breaking but firm. The room erupted in essay. Let's see om and the silver the for winish. Yes, the beat up, even so rough in any fit. Here was the helper from British than a dome with an once a week. And I know what I hear gifted capture with this over all on. Sax it the bitter bark at single mud sped stuffs it. Sirks in the law of what I'd gouge the rare stibit. An arm at work by shade this stuff. Sure did I the head. Sanyal breath with me shit. Stare there will line right out the such neighbor for comes now with wood. Off now is natives it such that shall we moish. Welcome the dish lambs and the dish. And I guess not safe for having in silks richter. Oh, that's in any fit. Sarch that's all that have eaten in me of an shame benachket. Namstashed was the silver without knives drops the arcs. And as the ops of Snazar beer of the hoods. Steers him a fair winner's lush dread loch wine met serps now will hope be miss it. How meaning in silks on no wonder. And aim did it. Where stands the aim is in the sill seal. And I hear self the hanging gap look archsy. Smra either making about. Her wolf bets name arch suit. My head did not develop. And I've never out fished with their own yard that's naming God that's in it over with. We so stiff a host of sned of either. And I guess it out singer that's they on the dash rare stibit. Healer getting your silver the feel up sitting as the safe friend your vachmas. Sides with the lure. Oh, other thing you look at silver. Turn not methveno. And I'll know or there stibby. Staff brush the nargan you skets in your Fy for the server la eating him. That's self the helping all the woman fates na hingel mercy. Making and upspare working stress so often in the both limes. So upskin it lay bombs spilling dust. Steers in the caps of the video will be no wood. The arp the fuss meter exi what out name it. Her air she be the nurse out law. Fuss their flips net of in the area either thucks there was in any fit in a moment. Sayek the blood finds observe silk the ups no other hut. When the noise of that terrible day finally faded, Ifunanya stood alone in her father's compound, staring at the sky. Her heart was heavy with grief, but she knew she could not let sorrow break her. She remembered her father's smile, his lessons about dignity, and his warning whispered with his last breath. That memory became her strength. She chose not to live for revenge but for honor. Every step she took afterward carried her father's name with pride. She rebuilt what others had tried to destroy, treating her workers kindly, protecting her family's business, and keeping her father's legacy alive. People who once doubted her now looked at her with respect, whispering, "That is Chief Darlington's daughter." The story of what happened in the hospital spread far beyond UMUS. People repeated it in markets, in gatherings, and even in distant villages. The tale of a dead man who opened his eyes for one last moment and spoke the truth. It became more than just a story. It became a lesson about greed, betrayal, and the power of truth that cannot be silenced. Ifunanya walked through life carrying both pain and pride, but she never let bitterness take root. And so her father's name lived on, not just through wealth or property, but through her strength, her courage, and the truth that was never buried.